Chapter 2. A Russian Erfurtian. Quote, "Our outlook is this. We share all the fundamental ideas of Marxism as they are expressed in the Communist Manifesto and in the programs of the West European Social Democrats." End quote. Lenin, 1900. One episode in the overarching narrative of the proletariat's world historical mission was the story of social democracy, the merger of socialism and the worker movement. The basic plot content of this episode was social democracy's efforts to bring insight and organization to the proletariat. It is time now to go down one narrative level and examine Russian social democracy as one episode in the story of international social democracy. Russian social democracy traced its roots back to the early 1880s and the programs and polemics of the Immigré Emancipation of Labor group led by Georgy Plekhanov. But social democracy as a practical movement within Russia itself only got going in the 1890s. Throughout the 1890s, one member of the small band of committed social democrats within Russia had a special interest in coming up with programmatic statements that tried to set forth the aims and outlook of the party as a whole. Since these statements are focused on social democratic consensus, they provide the best starting place for our search for Russian social democracy's narrative self-definition. Conveniently for our purposes, this avid program writer was Lenin himself. The bulk of the first 4 volumes of his collected works are devoted to polemics with populists and studies of Russian agriculture, including his magnum opus, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, 1899. Scattered among these weighty studies is a group of smaller writings whose aim was to define social democracy. Twice, Lenin actually drafted party programs along with commentary. Other writings responded to attacks on Russian social democracy by affirming basic principles. A third group of writings in 1899 was aimed at fellow social democrats, but the brunt of Lenin's case was that his opponents had stepped outside the fundamental social democratic consensus. Here's a list of Lenin's programmatic writings in the 1890s. 1. Who are these friends of the people and how do they fight against social democrats? 2. Frederick Engels. 3. Draft and explanation of a program for the Social Democratic Party. 4. Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats. 5. Protest writings. 6. Articles for Rabochya Gazeta, including Our Program, Our Immediate Task, and Urgent Question. And 7. A draft program for our party. What should we expect to find in these writings? To sharpen this question, I introduced the label Erfurtian. I want to avoid the usual diffuse discussions about whether Lenin was an orthodox Marxist or social democrat. Let us consider the case of a young Russian revolutionary trying to find a secure political orientation around the time, 1891, that the SPD was holding its Erfurt Congress in an atmosphere of triumph for having emerged from Bismarck's anti-socialist persecution even stronger than before. Such a Russian revolutionary might well be inspired by this massive and imposing Marxist party. He might well have become an Erfurtian, which we define as someone who A. accepts the SPD program that met at Erfurt as a model in both organization and activity, B. accepts the program adopted by the Erfurt Congress as a model social democratic program, and C. accepts Kautsky's commentary on the Erfurt program as authoritative. The material presented in the previous chapter leads us to expect to find the following in the programmatic writings of a Russian Erfurtian in the 1890s. 1. Erfurt allegiance, an explicit acknowledgement of the 3 sources of authority, the party, the program, and Kautsky's writings. 2. Merger formula, a commitment to the merger formula. Social democracy is the merger of socialism and the worker movement. This commitment shows itself in A. the merger account of the origins of social democracy, and B. the two-front polemical war against those who refuse the merger. 3. Good news, a definition of social democracy's mission as spreading the good news of the workers' world historical mission. This definition further implies A. a political strategy aimed at bringing insight and organization to the worker class, B. a commitment to the circles of awareness model of the laboring classes, and C. confidence that the workers will respond to the message. 4. Party ideal, an aspiration to establish an independent class-based political party. Such a party will have a clear commitment to the final goal of socialism. It will be centralized and disciplined. It will be as democratic as possible, and it will be organized on a nationwide scale, making effective use of specialization and division of labor, including full-time officials. 5. political freedom, an insistence on the urgent priority of achieving political freedom, which in Russia means overthrowing the autocracy. 6. Popular leadership, an expectation that the Social Democratic Party will be able to become a party of the working people. 7. Hegemony, a commitment to the hegemony strategy. Precisely because the first priority of the workers is to achieve socialism, they are the natural leaders in the national struggle for political freedom. And 8. Internationalism, an aspiration to join and be worthy members of the international social democratic movement. Using this checklist, we shall show that Lenin was a completely committed Erfurtian. Of course, Lenin's outlook was not a pale photocopy of Western models. This could not be, since the fierce absolutism of Tsarist Russia and the entire absence of political freedom posed a challenge to the mere existence of anything resembling social democracy in Russia. Populist revolutionaries were quick to point out this fact to the fledgling Social Democrats. The clash between populists and Social Democrats in the mid-1890s was the first of many disputes over the applicability of the SPD model in Tsarist Russia. Later in the decade, Social Democratic voices sounded the same note of skepticism, but while the populists counseled terrorism to replace the impossible Social Democratic underground, the Social Democratic economists counseled economic struggle as the only one possible until political freedom was achieved. Lenin had to show the skeptics that Russian Erfurtianism was a coherent political stance. It is here, in this extraordinary stubbornness about the possibility of a genuine underground social democracy, that a passionately individual profile emerges. Lenin's stubbornness springs from a commitment more intense and emotional than usual to certain aspects of the standard social democratic narrative. The joke of the time had it that Karl Kautsky was the pope of social democratic ideology. If so, then Lenin comes across as more social democratic than the pope. One way of proceeding would be to take these programmatic writings as a whole and illustrate each theme in the checklist with appropriate passages for many of the writings. In my view, this procedure would be justifiable since I believe that Lenin retained the same Erfurtian outlook throughout the 1890s, indeed at least up to 1917. But it would be imprudent to adopt a procedure that assumes what many dispute, namely, the continuity of Lenin's views. We will therefore proceed chronologically and go through each writing with checklist in hand. In one sense, the material in this chapter does not provide a direct threat to the worry about workers' interpretation of what is to be done. The writers in this tradition usually grant that Lenin was orthodox throughout much of the 1890s. They even use these earlier writings to show just how much Lenin changed when he had his crisis of faith and became a secret revisionist. Nevertheless, Lenin's Erfurtianism in the 1890s ultimately poses some severe difficulties for the textbook interpretation. It is one thing to say, yes, prior to what is to be done, Lenin seemed more confident about the spread of awareness, and it is another thing to observe the strength and intensity of that commitment in writing after writing. We shall also find Lenin making arguments that upon examination are very hard to distinguish from his allegedly heretical assertions on what is to be done, and yet they are embedded in writings whose orthodoxy remains unchallenged. We shall also obtain a rounded view of Lenin's two-front polemical war that will help us put his what is to be done focus on economism into context. Friends of the People, 1894. In 1894, the 24-year-old Lenin wrote a book-length polemical manifesto entitled, "Who Are These Friends of the People and How Do They Fight Against the Social Democrats?" The work was circulated in samizdat-type fashion. It takes up 220 pages of the first volume of Lenin's collected works, and 1/3 of it is missing. This is the work of one who has fully assimilated an existing doctrine, who is thrilled by its power and scope, and who is itching to demonstrate its power by taking on all comers. For a long time, all copies of Friends of the People were presumed missing. When 2/3 of it showed up in 1923, shortly before Lenin's death, Lenin's companions and first biographers, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nadezhda Krupskaya, were thrilled. They saw Friends of the People as proof that right at the start of his career, Lenin had acquired the essentials of the worldview that guided him for the rest of his life, up to and including the NEP of the 1920s. In her memoirs, Krupskaya made this work sound more fundamental than what is to be done. Whereas Friends of the People had immense significance in setting out the path to be followed by the revolutionary movement, what is to be done defined a plan for wide revolutionary work and pointed to a definite task. I agree with Lenin's lieutenants about the significance of Friends of the People. Amidst all the violent polemical abuse are passages that set forth in relatively straightforward fashion a social democratic political strategy. These programmatic passages do indeed reveal Lenin as a rare example of a person who makes his entrance on the political scene with his worldview fully formed. Zinoviev was particularly taken with the last sentence of the main text. These words, written almost 30 years ago, sound as if they had been written today. This final sentence was clearly crafted by Lenin with some care to provide a fitting climax. It is in fact the most succinct statement of what Lenin meant by social democracy and what he thought social democracy's role in Russia should be. In Friends of the People, worker, рабочий, means specifically urban factory workers as one section of the wider Russian proletariat that included all laborers suffering under capitalist exploitation. After stating that the Russian Social Democrats concentrate all their attention and all their activity on the class of industrial urban workers, Lenin proceeds to sketch out the aim of this activity, and I've retained the emphatic capitalization of the original. Quote, "When the advanced representatives of this class assimilate the ideas of scientific socialism, the idea of the historical role of the Russian worker, when these ideas receive a broad dissemination, when durable organizations are created among the workers that transform the present uncoordinated economic war of the workers into a purposive class struggle, then the Russian worker, elevated to the head of all democratic elements, will overthrow absolutism and lead the Russian proletariat, side by side with the proletariat of all countries, by the direct road of open political struggle to the victorious communist revolution." End quote. We note, first of all, that this climactic programmatic sentence presents the social democratic political strategy in narrative form, as a scenario of future developments. While we turn to the checklist, we discover that every single element on the list, with the exception of an explicit statement of Erfurtian allegiance, an element found elsewhere in Friends of the People, is at least foreshadowed in this remarkable sentence. Let us go down the list. Merger formula. This is foreshadowed by the eloquent word assimilate, usvoyet. The ideas of scientific socialism already exist. They do not emanate from the Russian working class itself, they are assimilated. Although these ideas originate from outside the working class, social democracy only really starts its work when they have become part of the very identity of at least some of the workers. Good news. Social democracy's job is to ensure that the inspiring insight about the historic role of the workers receives a broad dissemination, and that economic war is turned into a genuine class struggle by purposive organization. The circles of awareness are clearly delineated by Lenin's sentence. Starting from advanced perspectives of the factory workers, social democratic awareness moves out, in turn, to factory workers, the proletariat as a whole, and finally, democratic elements, that is, urban and rural petty bourgeoisie who are not ripe for socialist propaganda but are potential supporters of a thorough democratic transformation in Russia. Lenin's confidence in the successful spread of the social democratic good news is conveyed simply by the narrative form of that sentence. Party ideal. The ideal of an independent class-based political party is strongly implied by the assertion that organizations based on the class struggle will undertake the political task of overthrowing absolutism. National leadership. The Russian worker is called upon to lead all democratic elements to accomplish a task of the utmost pressing urgency for Russia as a whole, namely, the overthrow of the autocracy that dooms Russia to barbarism. Political freedom. Overthrowing the autocracy, in other words, achieving political freedom, is vital not only for Russia, but for the workers who can then set out on the direct road of open political struggle. Open should be understood as meaning without the censorship and repression that keeps us from bringing insight and organization to the workers in the most effective way possible. Hegemony. The anti-czarist revolution will only occur when the workers organized by social democracy take their place at the head of all democratic elements. Internationalism. One reason for overthrowing autocracy is to be able to work openly with the proletariat of all countries. If I were asked to present my interpretation of Lenin as concisely as possible, I would quote Lenin's sentence from 1894 and then merely add, "This was his story, and he stuck to it." Friends of the People contains many other revealing programmatic passages. One of the most famous of the heretical passages in What is to be Done starts with the words, "The history of all countries bears witness." This was no new procedure for Lenin. As we shall see again and again, the most natural way for him to set forth his political ideal was to point to West European, and particularly German, experience. The historical material in Friends of the People is the best source for putting flesh on the narrative skeleton evoked in the final sentence. Lenin starts with the failure of the pre-Marx utopian socialists to merge with the worker movement. Quote, "Despite a whole phalanx of extremely talented people who set out these ideas, and of many completely committed socialists, their theories remained apart from life. Their program remained apart from the political movements of the people, until large-scale machine industry drew the masses of the worker proletariat into the whirlpool of political life, and until the true watchword of their struggle was found." End quote. The people Lenin was polemicizing against in the 1890s were also utopian in outlook, but they did not have the excuse of living before Marx found the true watchword of the struggle. According to the merger story, the curse that afflicts utopian socialists who refuse the great synthesis even after Marx found the correct watchword of the struggle is to degenerate into harmless reformists. The brunt of Lenin's polemic against the Russian populists of the 1890s uses this narrative template. The revolutionary populists of the 1870s did not really understand the nature of class struggle, but at least they were fighters. The present-day populists, who claim to be their heirs, still refuse to understand the necessity of class struggle, and thus are reduced to begging for reforms from elite society and the czarist state. Where the utopian socialists failed, the SPD succeeded. They had the two things needed for success: a receptive worker movement and the proper Marxist watchwords. But was this SPD success relevant to Russia? This was the crucial question. Lenin had to respond to the argument made by Russian populists that Marx and social democracy were all right for the West, but not for Russia. In Western Europe, the argument runs, Marx was dealing with a worker movement that capitalism had already created. In Russia, in contrast, capitalism was obviously unable to create a worker movement. At the time of these polemics, there were hardly any signs of organized worker resistance in Russia, although the situation was shortly to change. The question thus became, is Marx correct in predicting that capitalism would socialize the Russian workers, that is, make them a historical agent on a society-wide scale that would be capable of carrying out their assigned historical mission? Lenin's answer to this question is one of the best presentations of the narrative core of his outlook. Quote, "Only the most superficial acquaintance with the facts could inspire the idea that Marx operated with a ready-made proletariat. Marx's communist program was worked out by him even before 1848. What kind of worker movement was there in Germany at that time? At that time, there weren't even any political freedoms, and the work of the communists was limited to secret circles, as with us today. It was the social democratic worker movement that brought home to everybody the revolutionary and uniting role of capitalism. And this movement began 2 decades later, when the doctrine of scientific socialism had been thoroughly worked out, when large-scale industry had spread wider, and when a series of talented and energetic disseminators of that doctrine in the worker milieu were found. Putting historical facts into an incorrect light, forgetting about the mass of labor put by socialists into bringing purposiveness and organization to the worker movement, our philosophers on top of that also attribute to Marx an utterly senseless viewpoint of historical fatalism. According to Marx, we're told, the organization and socialization of the workers occurs all by itself, and therefore it seems if we look at capitalism and don't see a worker movement, then that's because capitalism has not fulfilled its mission, and not because we are still working feebly at the job of organization and propaganda among the workers. This Philistine and cowardly trick of our homegrown philosophers is not even worth refuting. It is refuted by the entire activity of social democrats in all lands. It is refuted by every public speech of whatever Marxist you wish. Social democracy, as Kautsky says with complete justice, is the merger of the worker movement with socialism. And for the progressive work of capitalism to appear among us as well as elsewhere, our socialists must get down to their own work with all energy. They must work out a detailed Marxist understanding of Russian history and actuality while investigating more concretely all forms of class struggle, as well as the exploitation that is especially obscure and hidden in Russia. Further, they must popularize that theory, bring it, принести, to the worker. help the worker assimilate it and work out a form of organization appropriate to our conditions, for the purpose of spreading social democratism, and for the cohesion of the workers into a political force. Russian Social Democrats have never claimed that they have already finished or completed the work of ideologues of the working class. There is no end to this work in sight. On the contrary, they have always emphasized that they have only begun it, and that a lot of effort from a lot of people will be required before anything durable is created." End quote. Just as in What is to be Done, Lenin here says that the Social Democrats must bring, prinisti, the word used in What is to be Done, socialist theory to the workers from without. The Friends of the People passage seems to go even further than What is to be Done, since one might get the impression that Lenin here says that the Social Democrats are needed even to create the worker movement in the first place. Although I don't think this is correct, since Lenin is here talking about how to obtain a worker movement fully capable of carrying out its historical mission. So the question arises, why is this passage from 1894 not given rise to the same sense of scandal as the famous passage from What is to be Done? If the 1902 version is heresy, then so is the 1894 version. The reason why scholars have not pounced on the from without heresy in its 1894 form is that the confidence underlying the merger formula is too evident here to be missed. Why does Lenin insist on the fact that the worker movement and socialism were separated in Western Europe for decades until German social democracy got underway? Because he has gloomy feelings and forebodings about the Russian workers' lack of revolutionary inclinations? No, rather because he wants to refute the pessimistic outlook of his opponents. He therefore argues somewhat as follows. You say that there is no revolutionary worker movement in Russia. Well, maybe so, but the worker movement in Western Europe was also non-revolutionary at the beginning, and look what happened there. So just wait till we Social Democrats spit on our hands and get down to work, and you'll soon see a revolutionary worker movement. The history of all countries, from without argument, always occurs in the same polemical context of refuting skepticism about the chances for social democracy in autocratic Russia. Indeed, the shortest summary of Lenin's program for the Russian Social Democrats is this: look at the Germans, then go thou and do likewise, with appropriate changes for local conditions. Thus, the Russians should take their watchword from Wilhelm Liebknecht, one of the founders of German social democracy: studieren, propagandieren, organisieren. In other words, bring insight and organization to the worker class. Quote, "The political activity of the Social Democrats consists of the following: assist in the development and organization of the worker movement in Russia, assist in the transformation from its present condition of scattered attempts at protests, riots, and strikes that lack any unifying and guiding idea into an organized struggle of the entire working class. A struggle that is directed against the bourgeois regime as such, that aspires to the expropriation of the expropriators and to the utter destruction of the social order that is based on the oppression of the laborers. The basis of this activity is the general conviction of Marxists that the Russian worker is the natural and sole representative of the entire laboring and exploited population of Russia." End quote. One central reason the factory worker is the natural leader of the whole people is that capitalism has shook him up and started him thinking. And once the worker starts thinking, the Social Democrats are assured of victory. All that is needed for the worker to actualize his leadership potential is a simple explanation to him of his own position, Lenin's emphasis. Once the Russian Marxists have worked out a solid theory of class antagonisms in Russia, then, quote, "any awakening of the protesting thought of the proletariat will inevitably lead this thought into the channel of social democratism. The more we move forward in working out this theory, the faster will be the growth of social democratism, since even the cleverest preservers of the present order lack the power to interfere with the awakening of thought of the proletariat." End quote. Where did Lenin get this confidence in the inspiring power of social democratic doctrine? No prizes for guessing this answer: the experience of German social democracy. In the midst of his ideas on Marx, the populist writer N.V. Mikhailovsky admitted that Marx's ideas had been assimilated by the German worker class. Mikhailovsky attributed this to the workers' uncritical acceptance of an essentially unscientific prediction of a better future. He sneered at a science that could fit easily into a pocket-sized dictionary. Lenin's sarcastic reply: Oh yes, how truly awful. Science and social democratic pamphlets that cost a penny and fit in your pocket. Lenin took at face value and felt genuinely inspired by the German Party's claim to combine science and penny pamphlets. Friedrich Engels, 1895. In late 1895, Lenin wrote a short eulogy for Engels, who had died a few months earlier. In the previous chapter, we noted that, in this article, Lenin gave credit to Engels' Condition of the Working Class as the first exposition of the merger formula. Here, I want to show how Lenin enlisted Engels for the fight for political freedom in Russia. One of the mainstays of the textbook interpretation is Lenin's admiration for Narodnaya Volya, People's Will, the group of populist revolutionaries who assassinated the Tsar in 1881. Due to his rejection of European social democracy, it said, Lenin turned for inspiration to these conspiratorial terrorists. Yet, the main significance of Narodnaya Volya for the Russian Social Democrats was that this group was the first in the Russian socialist revolutionary tradition to understand and act on the imperative of achieving political freedom. This meant that, in Lenin's mind, Narodnaya Volya and Marx and Engels were all sending the same message on this crucial issue. Lenin reminded his readers that Marx and Engels both became socialists after being Democrats, and a democratic feeling of hatred towards political arbitrariness was particularly strong in them. Their support for Narodnaya Volya was therefore no surprise. Quote, "The heroic struggle of a small band of Russian revolutionaries against the mighty Tsarist government found a hugely sympathetic echo in the hearts of these tried-and-true revolutionaries," Marx and Engels. On the other hand, to turn away from the most immediate and important task of Russian socialists, the conquest of political freedom, for the sake of imaginary economic gain, was something suspicious in their eyes. They even considered it direct treason to the mighty cause of the social revolution. The liberation of the proletariat must be their own deed. This is what Marx and Engels constantly thought. And in order to fight for their economic liberation, the proletariat must conquer for itself certain political rights. Marx and Engels also clearly recognized the immense international significance of a free Russia that did not oppress nationalities or increase military tensions in Europe. This is why the progress of the worker movement in the West provided another motive for Engels to desire fervently the establishment of political freedom in Russia. The international significance of the Russian anti-Tsarist revolution is stressed again and was to be done. At the time of writing, Lenin knew of no Russian social democrats who downplayed the task of achieving political freedom. His evocation of the democratism of Marx and Engels makes it easy to guess how he would react when such social democratic economists appeared a few years later. Prison Program Draft, 1895 and 6. In December 1895, Lenin, along with other leading Petersburg Social Democrats, was arrested and spent over a year in Petersburg jails before being shipped off to Siberia. Jail conditions allowed him a fair amount of contact with the outside world, and he was able to comply with the request of some younger activists to draft a program and commentary for the fledgling social democratic groups. The activists had begun to feel the need for a declaration that would define the basic principles of social democracy. Lenin wrote a 4-page program and a 23-page commentary on the first half of the program. Neither program nor commentary was published until the 1920s. The overall form of Lenin's program is clearly modeled on the Erfurt program. First comes a description of the effects of capitalism, then a statement of basic party aims, and finally a list of concrete goals, divided into 2 categories of general political reforms and specific worker protection measures. The main contrast with the German program is the special attention given in Lenin's draft to the battle for attaining elementary political freedoms, that is, to the imperative of overthrowing the Tsar and the basic strategy for doing so. Lenin also added a 3rd category of concrete measures aimed at protection of peasant interests. If we take the formal imitation of the Erfurt program as a fairly open statement of allegiance, then all 8 parts of our checklist are reflected in the 1895 program and commentary. We will focus here on the description of the party's central tasks, and in particular on the relationship between the party and the worker movement. The Erfurt program formulated the basic task of Social Democratic Party in the following way. Quote, "To shape this fight of the worker class into a purposive and united effort, and to show to it its naturally necessary end. This is the task of the Social Democratic Party." End quote. The corresponding passage in Lenin's program is clearly based on its German counterpart. The Russian Social Democratic Party announces as its task to help the struggle of the Russian working class by development of the class self-awareness of the workers, by assistance to their organizations, and by pointing out the tasks and aims of the struggle. In his commentary on this passage, Lenin ties it firmly to the merger formula. Quote, "This paragraph of the program is the most important and central one because it shows what should be the activity of a party that defends the interests of the worker class and what should be the activity of all purposive workers. It shows the way by which the aspiration of socialism, the aspiration of ending the eternal exploitation of man by man, must be merged with movement of the people that arose out of the conditions of life created by large-scale factories and workshops." End quote. As we saw in Friends of the People, Russian Social Democrats had placed their wager on the eventual appearance in Russia of a genuine worker movement, that is, of organized and militant resistance. When he wrote Friends of the People, Lenin could only exude confidence that the worker movement would indeed make its appearance in Russia. By the time the prison draft was written at the end of 1895, however, genuine contact had been made between Social Democrats and workers in Petersburg. These contacts bore fruit the following year, with a series of strikes by textile workers that continued on and off for over a year and struck all observers with their impressive organization and discipline. The Petersburg strikes were an epochal event in the history of Russian social democracy because they appeared to be concrete proof that the merger between socialism and the worker movement could really happen in Russia. Boris Gorev recalls how delighted he and his companions were by this confirmation. "We were literally drunk from happiness and pride." He remembers coming to the apartment of two social democratic women and finding them dancing ecstatically around the floor. These developments allowed Lenin to talk about a worker movement already in existence. Quote, "Everywhere in Russia is beginning a transition of the workers to an unremitting struggle for their essential demands, a struggle for concessions, for better conditions of life, of pay, and of working hours. This transition is a giant step forward made by the Russian workers. The attention of the Social Democratic Party and all purposive workers must be focused on this struggle and on giving assistance to it." End quote. Thus, the task of the party was to attach itself to the worker movement, bring light to it, nести в него свет, and to help the workers in the struggle that they themselves had started. Lenin's mission statement makes a careful distinction between help in the form of developing class awareness and help in the form of pointing out the final aim. In essence, this is the same distinction made in What Is to Be Done between Trade-Unionist awareness and social democratic awareness. To use the language of What Is to Be Done, Trade-Unionist awareness means a conviction of the need to unite in unions, to carry on struggle with the owners and so on, up to and including a political fight for favorable legislation. In What Is to Be Done, Lenin's polemic is aimed at those who, he claims, would stop at this level and who would neglect the further duty of pointing out the final aim, whence the derogatory term Trade-Unionist awareness. Readers of What Is to Be Done who are not aware of the technical definition of worker movement, nor its role in the merger narrative, and who, to boot, misread the term Trade-Unionist, naturally read this as contemptuous and dismissive of mere protection of worker interests. In 1895 and 6, Lenin held the same position as he did later. The worker movement in isolation is insufficient. But at that time, it did not occur to him that any social democrat would challenge this position. His aim is, rather, to set out in a non-polemical way the importance of helping the worker movement as such. In What Is to Be Done, due to polemical context, this importance is taken for granted and not amplified. For today's reader of What Is to Be Done, therefore, the 1895 and 6 discussion fills in a crucial gap when it describes the crucial but limited task of developing class self-awareness. Following Lenin's usage, class self-awareness can be defined as the workers' awareness of themselves as a distinct interest group, but not necessarily the necessity for socialist transformation of society and the workers' mission to carry out this transformation. How do the workers attain this pre-socialist awareness? First and foremost, they learn it from the struggle upon which they themselves embark out in self-defense. Following the stages of the class struggle set down in the Communist Manifesto, Lenin describes the original phase of violent revenge against individual capitalists. This is a necessary phase, since hatred toward the capitalist is everywhere and always the first stimulus for the awakening of the workers striving to defend themselves. But the Russian worker movement has already grown out of the first phase. After this phase, the workers move on to strikes, and every strike, win or lose, is valuable education for the workers. They learn the methods of capitalist exploitation and the sources of their own strength, and they begin to acquire political awareness. This whole process is extremely encouraging for Russian Social Democrats, since the transition of the Russian workers to this kind of struggle points to the huge step forward made by them. This struggle places the worker movement on the direct road and serves as a reliable guarantee of its further progress. The task of the Social Democrats is therefore to speed up this development of class self-awareness by participating in the workers' own defense of their essential needs. For example, a strike leads directly to political awareness when the workers listen to factory inspectors who themselves patiently explain that the abusive actions of the bosses are entirely legal. To this useful lesson about the class nature of the state are added leaflets and other explanations of the socialists, so that during such a strike the workers receive in full measure their political education. In this way, the Russian Social Democrats work for the Great Merger from the side of the worker movement. The Social Democrats also work for the merger from the other side, from the side of socialism, when they explain the real goals of the struggle. In order to carry out their mission, the workers have to understand why the interests of the capitalists and the workers are antagonistic, and will continue to be antagonistic until private property is abolished. We see that Lenin in 1895 and 6 makes a conceptual distinction between the understanding that arises directly out of the struggle of the worker movement and the understanding that comes from the explanations of the socialists. The 1895 and 6 commentary shows how the stress on original separation in no way implies a pessimistic or dismissive attitude toward the worker movement. Worker resistance is heroic and admirable. It moves steadily onward in organization and insight, and all social democrats have a duty to participate in it. Nevertheless, they also have a duty to explain socialism. Both duties tend toward the same result, the merger of socialism and the worker movement. Lenin's commentary touches only briefly on organizational questions. One task is to set up strike organizations and worker funds. Another quite distinct task is the ever more necessary organization of protection from the police, keeping worker organizations and their relations secret, provision of illegal literature, and other tasks arising out of Tsarist repression. There is a straight line from this brief evocation of the challenge posed by Tsarist repression to what is to be done's stress on konspirishtia in the revolutionary by trade, or professional revolutionary. I conclude our survey of the 1895 and 6 program by citing a couple of passages from the commentary to bring out Lenin's emotional commitment to the hegemony scenario. One emotion is hatred for Tsarist lawlessness and its chinovniki, a contemptuous term for bureaucrat. Quote, "Citizens in Russia are deprived of any right to demand an account from the chinovniki, verify their actions, bring legal action against them. Citizens are even deprived of the right to deliberate on state matters. They do not dare to set up assemblies or organizations without the permission of these same chinovniki. Thus, the chinovniki are responsible in the full sense of the word. They constitute a separate caste that stands over citizens. The irresponsibility and arbitrariness of the chinovniki, coupled with the population's utter lack of voice, gives birth to such crying abuses of the chinovniki's power, to such violations of the rights of ordinary people, that is hardly possible in any European country." End quote. The other emotion is the inspiring nature of the crusade against the Tsar. Quote, "And if even now, when the struggle of the workers and their closing of ranks is just beginning, the government hurries to make concessions to the workers in order to halt the further growth of the movement, then without a doubt, when the workers close ranks and unite under the leadership of a single political party, they will know how to compel government to surrender. They will know how to conquer political liberty for themselves and for the entire Russian people." End quote. Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats, 1897. This 25-page pamphlet, written in Siberian exile in 1897 and published abroad the following year, is Lenin's most important political writing prior to Iskra. For us, as interpreters of what is to be done, it is crucial in a couple of ways. First, its appearance set off the chain reaction of back-and-forth polemics that only ended 4 years later with what is to be done. Although both of the social democratic immigrant groups in Geneva rated the pamphlet and its author very highly, one group made a mild criticism, and the other group refuted the criticism. Lenin sided passionately with the group making the mild criticism. But more of that in Chapter 5. Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats also serves as a touchstone for the orthodoxy or lack thereof of what is to be done. When Tasks was first published in Geneva in 1898, the pamphlet came equipped with a glowing foreword by Pavel Axelrod, one of the founding fathers of Russian social democracy, who described the unnamed author as, quote, a revolutionary who happily combines the experience of an excellent pratique with theoretical education and wide political views. For émigrés such as myself who have left the homeland long ago, it is exceptionally pleasant to feel and acknowledge oneself in complete solidarity with the most thoughtful and active leaders of the revolutionary movement in Russia. End quote. Axelrod even gave the pamphlet semi-official status by calling it a commentary on the manifesto issued earlier in 1898 by the abortive First Congress of the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Worker Party, or RSDWP. Lenin also had a high opinion of this pamphlet. He republished it 3 times, in 1902, 05, and 07, each time with the express purpose of bringing out the continuity in his views. In a foreword to the 1902 edition, he wrote that Tasks came from a period when Russian Social Democrats were united in their views. If what is to be done was a reaction to a period of wavering, then Tasks expressed the original orthodox standpoint that the waverers had come to doubt. In 1905, he wrote that Tasks gave an outline of general tasks, while later works like 2 Tactics presented the specific tasks of the moment. Finally, in 1907, in the introduction to a collection of his writings from 1895 to 1905, he stated that the views that in other articles and brochures of the present collection are set forth as polemics with the right wing of social democracy are set forth here in positive form. Axelrod and Lenin's views on this pamphlet confirm the thesis advanced here that Lenin never swerved from basic social democratic principles. They also pose something of a dilemma for the textbook interpretation. Either the heretical views founded in What Is to Be Done are already set forth in Tasks in 1897, but then how do we account for Axelrod's glowing endorsement? Or Lenin had a conversion experience at some point between 1897 and late 1901 and rejected the truly social democratic outlook of Tasks. But then how do we account for Lenin thrusting his rejected views before his readers on so many occasions? The usual line is that Lenin was a self-deceiving, unconscious heretic, but still, would not he have found his earlier views to be embarrassing, at least unconsciously? The tone of Tasks is much less stridently polemical than either Friends of the People or What Is to Be Done. Lenin explains that, since people now have a clear idea of what social democracy stands for, there is no need for a heated defense of the foundations of social democratism. Lenin's aim is only to dispel the prejudice that, somehow, social democracy is indifferent to the political struggle against the autocracy. Lenin little knew how soon he would again be engaged in a heated defense of basic principles, but this time against fellow social democrats. His defense of social democratic politics in 1897 is aimed at people who criticize social democracy for ignoring the revolutionary political struggle, while in the following years, it is aimed at people who criticize social democracy for being obsessed with revolutionary political struggle. In Tasks, Lenin responds to skepticism about the possibility of applying the Erfurtian strategy to Russia. One form of skepticism rejected SPD-style enlightenment. Does not this strategy concentrate too much on the urban factory workers and ignore the great numbers of exploited workers in Russia who do not fit this category? Another form of skepticism rejected SPD-style organization. Is not this kind of mass organization impossible in absolutist Russia? If so, a political conspiracy remains the only way to achieve political freedom needed for the genuine mass movement. In his reply to the objection about SPD-style enlightenment, Lenin uses 2 central terms to Russian social democracy: propaganda and agitation. We need to examine the specialized meanings of these terms, especially since agitprop later acquired such justly negative associations. For us, propaganda means simplified slogans aimed at exploiting the irrationality of the masses. Thus, one scholar reproaches Lenin for openly advocating propaganda as a way of overcoming the natural moderation of the workers. In social democratic discourse, propaganda meant the exact opposite. It meant individualized, intensive study, embracing a wide range of social knowledge. Propagandized worker was a title of respect accorded to the graduates of the study circles. Propaganda was criticized, not because it was a cheap shortcut to unconsidered support, but rather because it was a labor-intensive method that produced only a few highly knowledgeable individuals. Agitation was closer to what we now call propaganda, simplified rhetoric meant to capitalize on specific abuses and outrages. The Social Democrats, of course, did not concede in any way that agitation exploited worker irrationality. It was rather meant to be a vivid teaching tool useful in getting across what revolutionaries themselves fervently believed to be the case: the connection between day-to-day abuses and the existence of capitalism and the autocracy. The emphasis on propaganda and agitation does not stem from a pessimistic conviction that the workers were not fulfilling the Marxist scenario. It arose, rather, from the heart of the SPD model, as well as the Marxist political strategy informing that model. Propaganda and agitation meant bringing the good news to the workers. In Lenin's exposition, the spreading circle of awareness starts with the basic truths about the worker mission. Socialist propaganda teaches the worker about the central task of international social democracy and the Russian worker class, while democratic propaganda leads up to the truth that a successful struggle for the worker cause is impossible without the achievement of political freedom and the democratization of Russia's political and social order. Lenin stresses that while propagandizing among the workers, social democracy cannot avoid political questions, and considers any attempt to avoid such questions, or even simply put them off, as a profound mistake, and as a retreat from the basic principles of world social democratism. Agitation then brings these truths in a simplified form to a wider circle by fusing, slit, them with everyday concerns of the worker movement. Because he is responding to criticisms that the Social Democrats concentrate too exclusively on the factory proletariat, Lenin is here more explicit than earlier about the way he sees the spread of awareness reach the outer circles. Social Democrats concentrate on the factory proletariat not because they wish to ignore the wider proletarian mass, the artisans, rural proletariat, the devastated peasants, but rather because the focus on the factory worker is the most rational use of very scarce resources. In Russia, the worker socialist continues to have close personal contact with these more backward categories and implants in them the ideas of socialism, class struggle, and the crucial importance of political freedom. Thus, Lenin envisages an almost unstoppable spread of awareness. Quote, "Agitation among the advanced strata of the proletariat is the most reliable and the unique path toward the awakening, as the movement becomes wider, of the whole Russian proletariat as well. The dissemination of socialism and of the idea of the class struggle among the urban workers inevitably pours these ideas into ever more narrow, ever more small-scale channels. For this to happen, it is necessary that these ideas first put forth deep roots in a more prepared milieu and saturate this vanguard of the Russian worker movement and the Russian Revolution." End quote. Further out than the wider proletarian mass is the outermost circle of awareness, namely the democratic elements, those sections of the people, the folk or the narod, that are capable of energetic support of democratic transformation, but who are hardly open to socialist ideas at present. Lenin wants these people to be organized, but not directly by social democracy. Lenin is so convinced by the basic Marxist axiom that energetic political action comes from clearly perceived class interests that he feels only non-socialist parties can really mobilize the democratic elements. The social democratic contact with this outer circle comes from social democracy's leadership and society's struggle to overthrow the autocracy. This leadership consists primarily in telling the workers about the abuses of the autocracy toward all classes of Russian society. Seeing the genuinely revolutionary workers on their side will encourage other discontented elements to actually do something to get rid of the hated Tsar. This concept of political agitation was put into practice by Iskra. Confidence in the spread of awareness goes together with a concern for purity of doctrine. A fledgling social democratic movement needs to be even more concerned with getting the essential message right than an older one. Lenin expounds this characteristic theme by using what was for him the highly emotional symbol of the banner. Quote, "Convinced that the revolutionary theory that serves as the banner of the revolutionary movement can today only be the teaching of scientific socialism and of the class struggle, Russian Social Democrats will disseminate it with all their strength, preserve it from misleading interpretations, and rebel against any attempt to saddle the young worker movement with vaguer doctrines." End quote. Lenin thus responds to skepticism about the applicability of SPD-style enlightenment by saying, Yes, granted, we do not have the opportunity to openly share our ideas among the Russian proletariat as a whole, yet the conditions of Russian life are such that our underground activity among the factory proletariat can have a multiplier effect as it trickles down via personal contact to the wider masses. Lenin also responded to skepticism about the applicability of SPD-style organization. One of the icons of revolutionary populism, Pyotr Lavrov, expressed this skepticism in an article published abroad in 1895. Lavrov granted that Russian Social Democrats seemed to be having success with SPD-style enlightenment. Quote, "But for socialists, the propaganda of ideas is no more than one element of preparation for socialist tasks. The other element is organization. In the West, whose social democratic activity serves as an unconditional model for Russian social democrats, history has created the soil for this organization. It has to be strengthened, widened, defended, but the soil of juridical forms and social customs is already there. In Russia, this soil is absent. The organization of the Russian Worker Party must be created under the autocracy and all its charms." End quote. For Lavrov, theoretical questions about economic materialism or the fate of the peasant commune were secondary compared to this practical problem. If an effective mass organization were possible under the autocracy, then of course the social democratic strategy would be the best. But such a strategy is extremely dubious, if not impossible. Lavrov concluded that the challenge for Russian socialists was to combine propaganda of socialist ideas with the organization of a revolutionary conspiracy, the only serious kind of political struggle under autocratic conditions. And the only ones tackling this kind of political struggle were the revolutionaries who remained loyal to the traditions of the Narodnaya Volya. In his response, Lenin granted that the organizational resources of the Russian Social Democrats were pitiful indeed compared to the Germans. Yet he paradoxically turned this fact into an argument for confidence by saying, "Look at the mighty effect even this weak social democracy is having already. Look at the experience of the Union of Struggle in Petersburg." Lenin was one of the founders of the Union of Struggle, although it achieved its greatest success after his arrest. The Petersburg proletariat accepted the Union's guidance and proceeded to carry out long-term strikes in so effective a fashion that the Russian government was forced to respond with a major piece of reform legislation. If the Social Democrats could accomplish so much with so little, owing to the support we found in the Petersburg worker class, then what miracles could they not accomplish if they got their act together in entirely possible ways? Lenin's underlying confidence is rarely expressed more concretely than in the following. Quote, "This concession, the law of June 2nd, 1897 on working hours, was a tiny one, the change a very insignificant one. But remember, the organization of the worker class that successfully compelled this change was also not distinguished either by breadth or strength or length of existence or wealth, either in experience or money. The Union of Struggle, as we know, was founded only in 1895 and 6, and its appeals to the workers were confined to some badly printed broadsheets. Can one possibly deny that if a similar organization united at least the largest centers of the worker movement in Russia, the St. Petersburg region, Moscow, Vladimir, the south, and the most important towns such as Odessa, Kiev, Saratov, and so on, and had a revolutionary press organ at its disposal, and enjoyed as much authority among the Russian workers as the Unity of Struggle did among the St. Petersburg workers, can anyone doubt that such an organization would be a political factor of the highest order in contemporary Russia, a factor that the government would have to take into account in both internal and external policy?" End quote. Lenin tells Lavrov, "We know as well as you do that we cannot have an open legal party like the SPD, and that the fight for political freedom cannot be separated from the fight for socialism. But we do not restrict our concept of political struggle to revolutionary conspiracies, as do you and the others who have not fully liberated themselves from the Blanquist traditions of Narodnaya Volya. We believe, rather, that the struggle against absolutism must consist not in the creation of conspiracies, but rather in the education, disciplining, and organization of the proletariat, and political agitation among the workers." Robert Service cites the words just quoted and comments, "The imagery is trenchantly hierarchical. It bursts through all the qualifying language of the sentences around it. Discipline was always a key theme in Lenin's thoughts." Evidently, Lenin was trying to keep hidden his deep personal desire to dominate and discipline, unsuccessfully, thanks to sharp-eyed commentators like Service. Yet the emphasis on discipline was not some personal quirk of Lenin's, but a fundamental goal not only of social democracy but of any worker movement. I would not like to go down to the local trade union branch during a strike and announce that only trenchantly hierarchical intellectuals care about discipline. As an example, we might cite the following comment from one of Lenin's polemical foes within Russian social democracy, the economist underground newspaper Рабочая мысль. Quote, "The worker movement in Russia can now consider itself as part of the pan-European worker movement. Now dying down to a barely flickering spark, now growing into a sea of fire, the Russian worker movement conquers the worker masses ever more deeply and widely, while it slowly but surely disciplines them as it teaches how to struggle with the enemy." End quote. Contrary to Service, Lenin does not in the least qualify his language when talking about discipline. He's too involved in responding to skepticism about whether an illegal underground party can bring about the disciplined struggle that everyone desires. Quote, "Leading the class struggle of the proletariat, developing discipline and organization among the workers, helping them fight for the economic needs and forcing capital to concede one position after another, educating the workers politically, systematically, and continually pursuing absolutism, badgering any czarist bushabazuk that makes the proletariat feel the heavy hand of the police government. Any organization that does all these things will be at one and the same time a worker party adapted to our conditions and a mighty revolutionary party directed against absolutism." End quote. Thus, the aim of Lenin's pamphlet is to make Russian social democracy more attractive by instilling confidence in its ability to deliver even under absolutist conditions. Lenin's confidence does not mean that he is less activist, as many scholars seem to logically expect would be the case, but more activist. The peroration of his pamphlet seeks to inspire his fellow social democrats by showing them the vast potential for success if only they will be up and doing. Quote, "Before Russian social democracy stands a field for work that is huge and barely begun. The awakening of the Russian worker class, its stihini aspirations for knowledge, for organizational merger, for socialism, for struggle against its exploiters and oppressors, reveals itself every day more and more extensively. The giant strides that Russian capitalism has made recently guarantees that the worker movement will grow without halt ever more deeply and widely. Russian social democrats must take pains to ensure that when the inevitable economic crisis comes, the proletariat will be capable of standing at the head of Russian democracy in a decisive struggle against the police absolutism that ties Russian workers and the whole Russian people hand and foot. And so, to work, comrades. We mustn't waste valuable time. Russian social democrats face a massive work. We must satisfy the demands of the awakening proletariat, organize the worker movement, strengthen revolutionary groups and their mutual ties, provide the workers with propagandistic and agitational literature, and unite the worker circles and social democratic groups that are scattered all over Russia into a single social democratic worker party." End quote. 3 Protests, 1899. Quote, "Can the people who are writing this really be social democrats?" End quote. Lenin, 1899. When he wrote Tasks in late 1897, Lenin felt that the battle to explain the essence of social democracy was over, and the party could move to more practical matters. In the later half of 1898, he found that he had been over-optimistic. There were still people around who, from Lenin's point of view, just didn't get it, and these were underground social democratic activists. Startled and indignant, Lenin penned 3 protests. The first was occasioned by a short document called the Credo. Lenin drafted a protest by Russian social democrats, had it signed by 16 other exiled social democrats, and sent it to Geneva, where it was published. The other 2 protests were also written at some time before Lenin's exile ended in early 1900, but were only printed in the 1920s. One was entitled A Retrogressive Tendency in Russian Social Democracy and directed against the separate supplement issued by the newspaper Рабочая мысль. The other unpublished protest was aimed at a profession de foi issued by Kiev Social Democrats. In Chapter 4, we will take a closer look at the statements that provoked such a fierce response from Lenin. Here, we will look at Lenin's protests as a passionate reaffirmation of his core beliefs. We shall take at face value Lenin's description of his opponent's views, since this will allow us to see what Lenin was defining himself against. Lenin charged his opponents with distorting the essence of social democracy, so his protests are an excellent source for capturing his own conception of that essence. At first, the dispute seems to be overwrought, all this uproar over the relative significance of political versus economic struggle. Scholars have often concluded the motive force behind the protests was hysteria. Opinions differ over whether the hysteria was genuine or cynically whipped up. But politics had long been something of a code word for two key planks in the social democratic platform: the necessity of an independent class-based political party and the urgency of political freedom. Anti-political trends in the international and Russian socialism, for example Bakuninist anarchism, rejected these two planks. The correct appreciation of politics was indeed at the heart of Marx-based social democracy. Lenin had another motive for being upset by the appearance of social democratic writing that could be perceived as anti-political. A common charge against the Russian Marxists, especially from those in the Narodnaya Volia tradition, was that the Marxists were passive fatalists who at most organized economic protest while ignoring revolutionary political struggle. Lenin's reaction in his earliest writings was to say, more or less, "You must be getting your idea of Marxism from glib talkers and literary salons. No genuine Russian social democrat ever believed anything like that." His confidence on this score was increased by the founding Congress of the RSDWP in 1898. The Congress had been organized by South Russian activists without any contribution from Lenin or his group. The Congress proved abortive in organizational terms. The delegates were arrested en masse, no central institutions were set up, plans to establish a central organ, or official party newspaper, fell through. Yet a nationwide party now had at least a notional existence, giving rise to various schemes for giving it a more corporeal existence. Local social democratic organizations who previously had called themselves Unions of Struggle renamed themselves Committees of the RSDWP, and this renaming had a real influence on the way they thought of themselves. Best of all, from Lenin's point of view, the Congress had issued a manifesto that affirmed Lenin's sense of the essence of social democracy. In particular, the 1898 manifesto announced that political freedoms were light and air to the Russian worker class, and that the Russian worker class must carry and will carry on its strong shoulders the cause of the conquest of political freedom. And now, a year later, social democratic activists were making statements that repudiated the assertions of the 1898 manifesto and justified the scorn towards social democracy expressed by other Russian revolutionaries. This was especially true of the underground Petersburg newspaper Rabochia Musi, Worker Thought. Lenin's other two protests were aimed at fugitive underground writings that would have vanished without the attention Lenin paid to them. Rabochia Musi was another matter. One of the first underground newspapers to survive for any length of time, it was a truly impressive achievement, both because of its ability to outwit the enraged police and because it published invaluable material from worker correspondence. The opponents of social democracy would certainly be justified in citing it as the authentic voice of Russian social democracy. Lenin's protest against Rabochia Musi's programmatic statements, entitled A Retrogressive Tendency in Russian Social Democracy, or retrogression for short, is the longest and most passionate of the three protests. In fact, retrogression contains some of the most eloquent assertions of his basic beliefs, and I particularly recommend it as the most revealing of Lenin's early writings. Taken together, the protests of 1899 provide excellent documentation of Lenin's commitment to Herfertianism. As we go through the checklist, we shall see that Lenin accused the new social democratic voices of denying, or at least moving away from, every plank in the platform. 1. Herfertian allegiance. A central theme throughout the three protests is that the new voices in Russian social democracy, as expressed by the Creda, Rabochia Musi, and the Profession de Foi, are rejecting the model of Western social democracy and the key lessons of European experience, even though the new Russian party was officially committed to this model and these lessons. Quote, "With an almost infinite lack of concern, our latest perverters of social democratism throw overboard all that is dear to social democracy, all that gives us the right to see the worker movement as a world historical movement. They don't care at all about the fact that the age-old experience of European socialism and European democracy teaches the necessity of striving toward the formation of independent worker political parties. They don't care at all that the history of the Russian revolutionary movement has gone through a long and difficult path to bring about the merger of great social and political ideals with the class struggle of the proletariat. They don't care at all that the advanced Russian workers have already laid the foundations of the Russian Social Democratic Worker Party. Down with all of that." End quote. 2. The merger formula. The protest writings contain Lenin's most elaborate retelling of the merger narrative, as we shall see later. 3. Good news. Lenin accused the new voices of reneging on the duty of inspiring the worker class with high ideals. They excuse themselves by grossly underestimating the willingness of the workers to receive the message. In response, Lenin elaborated his own sense of how awareness spread through the different levels of the worker class. 4. Party ideal. The new voices either ignored or expressed aggressive skepticism about the possibility of an independent, class-based, nationwide political party under repressive Russian conditions. Lenin's response was, well, you say that the autocracy has a highly structured organization with competent and resourceful officials dedicated to stamping out worker and socialist groups. True enough, but only a cowardly liberal therefore concludes that an organized underground struggle is impossible. A real social democrat will instead set about building our own highly structured organization that will turn workers and socialists into competent and resourceful experts in fighting the political police. Lenin's remarks on this point is an important stage in the crystallization of the idea of the revolutionary by trade, or professional revolutionary. We see that the emphasis on revolutionary expertise is in response to Rabotchia Musi's emphasis on the expertise of the police. This serves to demonstrate the purpose of the revolutionary by trade, not a substitute for a mass movement, but to make a mass movement possible under the autocracy. 5. Political freedom. Quote, why should the overthrow of the autocracy be the first task of the Russian worker class? Because, under the autocracy, the worker class cannot broadly develop its struggle, cannot conquer for itself strong positions either economically or politically, cannot create strong mass organizations, and cannot unfurl before all the laboring masses the banner of social revolution and teach them to fight for it. End quote. Instead of fighting for political freedom, the new voices asked the older leaders of Russian social democracy, why are you so obsessed about a parliament that we don't have? Why don't you concentrate on worker participation in such local representative institutions as Tsarism allows? To which Lenin replies, if we don't put the advantages of a parliament in the foreground, then from what source will the workers learn about political rights and political freedom? Social democrats are all for worker participation in local institutions, but participation by worker socialists, who are illegal by definition in Tsarist Russia. 5 and 6. Popular leadership and hegemony. The new voices did not believe that the conquest of political freedom needed to be Russian social democracy's most urgent task. Lenin retorted that, quote, when social democracy makes the overthrow of absolutism its most urgent task, it must show itself to be the advanced fighter for democracy, and just for that reason must provide any and all support to all democratic elements of the Russian population, enlisting them as allies. End quote. 8. Internationalism. A constant theme throughout the protest writings is that Russian social democracy is part of international social democracy, and as such is committed to its political strategy and the high ideals animating this strategy. All these propositions were fused together and given emotional content by the merger narrative. There's no ambiguity about the moral Lenin draws from the experience of all countries and retrogression. The Western European experience should be an inspirational model for all of us. What happened there is happening here, right before our very eyes. We must reject the naysayers who claim the workers are not eagerly moving toward the merger. Lenin tells the story in order to pound these lessons home. Given the importance in Lenin's writings, and especially in What Is to Be Done, of what can be called the history of all countries argument, we shall look at Lenin's narrative from retrogression in some detail. Instead of merger, soedinение, Lenin here uses the even stronger word fusion, slianye. Quote, in all European countries, socialism and the worker movement at first existed separately one from the other. The workers carried on a struggle with the capitalists and set up strikes and unions. Meanwhile, the socialists kept their distance from the worker movement and created teachings that criticized the contemporary capitalist bourgeois social system and demanded the replacement of that system with a higher, socialist system. The separation of the worker movement from socialism meant weakness and lack of development in both the one and the other. Socialist teachings that did not merge with the worker struggle remained only utopias, good intentions without any influence on real life. The worker movement remained petty and fragmented. It didn't acquire political significance. It wasn't illuminated by the advanced science of its time. For this reason, we see in all European countries a stronger and stronger striving to fuse socialism and the worker movement into a single social democratic movement. Given such a fusion, the class struggle of the workers became a purposive struggle of the proletariat for its liberation from the exploitation of the owner classes. This class struggle worked out the highest form of the socialist worker movement, an independent worker social democratic party. The central contribution of K. Marx and F. Engels was to direct socialism toward a merger with the worker movement. They created a revolutionary theory that explained the necessity of this fusion and gave socialists the task of organizing a class struggle of the proletariat." End quote. Lenin immediately applies this master narrative to Russia. Quote, "Exactly the same process occurred here in Russia. With us as well, socialism existed for a very long time, for many decades, at a distance from the struggle of the workers with the capitalists, the strikes of the workers, and all the rest. On one hand, the socialists didn't understand Marxist theory and considered it inapplicable to Russia. On the other hand, the Russian worker movement was still in a completely embryonic form." End quote. In the 1870s, the worker organizations were the first to understand the vital importance of political freedom, while the socialists stood aside, owing to their backward, mistaken theory. Thus, the Russian workers were perfectly justified to stand apart from socialism, as long as Russian socialism stood apart from them due to its infatuation with peasant and conspiratorial socialism. But as soon as the socialists got their act together and became social democrats, the worker movement was happy to move toward fusion, as shown in all its large-scale manifestations in the mid-1890s. Quote, "The fusion of the advanced workers with social democratic organizations was completely natural and inevitable. It was the result of that important historical fact during the 1890s that two profound social movements met in Russia. One was the Stihiniya People's Movement in the worker class, and the other was the movement of social thought toward the theories of Marx and Engels, to the teachings of social democracy. At the present time, the central task of all Russian socialists and all purposive Russian workers is to make this fusion durable, to strengthen and organize the worker social democratic party. He who doesn't want to recognize the fusion, he who strives artificially to bring some kind of division between the worker movement and social democracy in Russia, that person brings harm, not benefit, to the cause of worker socialism and the worker movement in Russia." End quote. But some people mistake the central task of the day. They call on the workers in essence to separate from social democracy, and in doing so, they throw overboard all the achievements of European and Russian experience. Although the fusion that is now completing itself is natural and inevitable, the new voices among social democrats who want to artificially tear apart the tie between the worker movement and socialism. It is instructive to compare the American scholar John Kautsky's summary of the argument of what is to be done. Under capitalism, the labor movement spontaneously tends to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie unless artificially diverted from this natural tendency by the Social Democratic Party. Lenin uses the European experience to illustrate the two-front polemical war. One of the new voices, the Credo, claimed that the European worker parties are now making a radical shift away from a political focus toward an economic focus. No, says Lenin, already in the 1840s, Marx and Engels were polemicizing against utopian socialists who believed that the economic struggle had no importance. From early on, the Marxist movement warned against both exaggerating the significance of economic struggle, as the English workers tended to do, or minimizing its significance, as some French and German groups such as the Lassalleans tended to do. The same with politics. Marxism warned against the obsession with politics of the conspiratorial Blanquists and against the dismissal of the political struggle in the manner of both wild anarchists and staid professional socialists. In the typical social democratic manner, Lenin defined social democracy by contrasting it with all the others who remained outside the synthesis and exaggerated the significance of their little bit of the truth. Lenin's whole Erfurtian strategy rests on his confidence that the Russian workers will enthusiastically respond to the socialist message. For this reason, he was especially outraged when one of the new voices asserted the Russian worker in the mass has not yet matured for political struggle. Lenin exploded, quote, The Russian worker in the mass has not yet matured for political struggle. If this is true, then it is equivalent to a death sentence on all social democracy, since it means that the Russian worker in the mass has not yet matured for social democratism. In fact, nowhere in the world has there been, nor is there now, a social democracy that is not utterly and completely tied to political struggle. Social democracy without political struggle? This is a river without water. This is a crying contradiction. This is a return to either the utopian socialism of our forefathers who despised politics, or to anarchism, or to trade unionism." End quote. Throughout the protest writings, Lenin is therefore insistent that the worker class has always and everywhere striven for political freedom. He rejects as slander the assertion that Western workers did not support democratic struggles. They did so, he asserts, at a time when the socialists themselves still rejected the primordial importance of political freedom, with the exception, of course, of Marx and Engels. In the 1870s, Russian workers strove for freedoms long before the socialists, and things have not changed in the interim. Quote, "Hasn't the Russian worker in the mass, over the course of more than 20 years, put his best, most developed, most honest, and daring comrades into the ranks of revolutionary circles and organizations? The Russian worker in the mass has not only matured for political struggle, but has demonstrated his maturity many times over. He has many times carried out the acts of political struggle, and indeed quite often carried them out in Stihiniya fashion." End quote. The workers make their political protests in Stihiniya fashion, that is, without the insight and organization that social democracy has dedicated itself to providing. And what do the new Russian Social Democrats do? Instead of devoting all their efforts to supply insight and organization, they show themselves to be indifferent or even begin to polemicize against the idea of political struggle. Scandal! Our survey of the protest writings of 1899 must create a strange impression for anyone raised on the textbook interpretation of what is to be done. According to this line of thought, the new voices within Russian social democracy led to such worry about the workers on Lenin's part that he lost all confidence in the socialist inclinations of the workers. He demanded that party activists artificially divert workers from their natural leanings. He gave up on the idea of a mass movement in autocratic Russia. He rejected the Western model in favor of the Russian revolutionary tradition, and in general showed himself to be an enemy of political freedom. In 1899, we see Lenin's immediate reaction to the new voices, and indeed, he is very angry and upset. He is pounding on the table, he is shouting at his adversaries, "How dare you lose confidence in the political maturity of the workers? How dare you artificially forestall the natural and inevitable merger of socialism and the worker movement? How dare you become defeatist about our ability to keep the political police from crushing a real mass movement? How dare you throw overboard as of no value the inspiring record of the Western worker parties? How dare you forget the primordial importance of political freedom?" Articles for Рабочая газета, 1899. At the end of 1899, there is a project afoot to resuscitate Рабочая газета, worker newspaper, the newspaper that had been designated by the abortive First Party Congress as the official organ of the party. As was typical of the underground newspapers of the 1890s, Рабочая газета came out with only 2 issues prior to the Congress in 1898 and none afterwards. Lenin was asked to contribute articles for the revived newspaper, and he complied with 3 short articles. The project fell through, the newspaper never appeared, and the articles were not published in Lenin's lifetime. Lenin discusses the episode and what is to be done. The articles are mainly valuable because Lenin here first set out the organizational themes that became the basis of the Iskra Group's activity in the following years. The role of a central newspaper in unifying the party, the need to overcome artisan-like localism, the imperative of inculcating a culture of konspiratia, and finally, the need for a clear program. These themes are the ones what is to be done set out to defend. In many ways, the original formulations of the 1899 articles are preferable to later versions that are more bogged down in polemics. Here, we will touch on only a few points to round out the picture of Lenin's Erfurtianism. Quote, "Social democracy cannot be reduced to simply providing services for the worker movement. It is the merger of socialism with the worker movement. To use Karl Kautzy's expression that reproduces the basic ideas of the Communist Manifesto, Its task is to bring in definite socialist ideals to the Stihijny workers' movement, to connect the worker movement to socialist convictions that must stand on the level of contemporary science, to connect it with systematic political struggle for democracy as a means for the realization of socialism. In one word, fuse this Stihijny movement in one unbreakable whole with the activity of the Revolutionary Party." End quote. After reading this sentence, the reader will stifle a pardonable yawn. Lenin here repeats what he's been saying in every programmatic article since 1894 when he wrote Friends of the People. But wait, the reader is uninstructed. According to Leonard Shapiro, this sentence actually reveals fruits of a complete transformation of Lenin's outlook that had occurred a month or two earlier. He argues that in these articles, there appears for the first time, in embryonic form, the basic ideas which were to become the characteristic features of what would later be called Bolshevism or Leninism. Shapiro does not explain why quoting Kautsky in 1899 signifies a radical change from quoting the same words by Kautsky in 1894. In these articles, Lenin sets forth the core of the organizational plan expounded in what is to be done, namely, using a national social democratic newspaper as a tool for creating a unified and nationwide party structure. Lenin asserts that his scheme is based on the history of socialism and democracy in Western Europe, the history of the Russian revolutionary movement, the experience of our worker movement. Nevertheless, both Europe today and Russia in the days of Narodnaya Volya are quite different from Russia today. Let us see whether Lenin's organizational dreams lead him to reject the European model in favor of models taken from the Russian revolutionary tradition. Lenin's tone when talking about revolutionary parties such as Narodnaya Volya is concessive. When his opponents point to the continued relevance of Narodnaya Volya, Lenin responds, yes, of course we acknowledge the need for underground technique. At the same time, he wants to set a fairly stringent limit to this concession. Quote, "Russian social democracy is distinct from early revolutionary parties in Russia in highly essential matters, so that the necessity of learning revolutionary technique and the technique of konspirishtia from the old Russian leaders, Koryfi, we have no hesitation at all in conceding this necessity, in no way relieves us of the responsibility to take a critical attitude toward them and to work out independently our own form of organization." End quote. The not particularly elaborate methods of konspirishtia of the past will help an underground newspaper get sufficient material, but distribution of the newspaper goes beyond the old techniques, since previous forms of the revolutionary movement in Russia simply did not set themselves the task of distributing newspapers to the masses of the people. Lenin's newspaper plan also takes into account an essential difference with European models. Quote, "The necessity of concentrating all our forces on the organization of a party organ that comes out regularly and is properly distributed shows the originality of our situation in comparison both to social democracy in other European countries and to older Russian revolutionary parties. Besides newspapers, the workers of Germany, France, and elsewhere have a mass of other means of announcing publicly what they're doing, as well as other means of organizing the movement: parliamentary activity, electoral agitation, popular meetings, participation in local social institutions, rural and urban, open activity of craft, trade, and guild unions, and so on and so on. With us, the revolutionary newspaper is the substitute for all of that, and I mean all of that, until such time as we conquer political freedom. Without a revolutionary newspaper, it is impossible for us to have any kind of broad organization of the whole worker movement." End quote. Lenin is saying, we differ from early Russian revolutionaries because, on the whole, we're superior. We have better theories, we set ourselves wider tasks. We differ from the Western social democrats because we are perforce inferior. We can only envy the broad range of outlets available to French and German workers. Nevertheless, with our one newspaper, we will strive to accomplish the essence of what the Germans are doing. Studieren, propagandieren, organisieren. The reader will recall that Lenin quoted this same Liebknecht slogan in his first programmatic writings in 1894. Lenin evokes both European experience and Russian experience in justifying his own proposals. But these two sources do not have equal rhetorical weight. When speaking about the Russian revolutionary model, Lenin contents himself with the general statement that there is much to learn from these people. We never hear of any concrete example of success in konspirishtia, or the name of any individual particularly noted for expertise in this matter, or even any specific techniques. In contrast, when Lenin talks about the experience of the European worker movement, concrete examples spill out of him. Let us use front organizations, just like the French workers did under Napoleon III and the German workers did under the emergency laws. Let us offload as much underground activity as we can to local organizations, as we are advised to do by Vorwärts, the central organ of the SPD. Let us be inspired by the German experience with an underground newspaper. Quote, during the epoch of the exceptional law against the socialists from 1878 to 1890, the German political police worked no worse, and perhaps even better, than the Russian police, and yet the German workers, thanks to their discipline and organization, were able to ensure that an illegal weekly newspaper was brought into the country from abroad and delivered to all subscribers, so that even government ministers could not help praising the Social Democratic Post, or the Red Post. We, of course, do not even dream of success on this scale." End quote. We have seen how Lenin invokes the example of both present-day Western Europe and the earlier Russian revolutionaries to support his plan for a nationwide newspaper. Lenin also makes a highly characteristic assumption about present-day Russia to boost the plausibility of his ambitious schemes. Among the worker youth can be found a passionate and unstoppable striving toward the ideas of democracy and socialism. So, if we can get these people to understand the importance of organization, then the plan of a regularly appearing paper need not remain a dream. Successful distribution is entirely possible because we can direct copies to industrial districts where the worker is factually master of the situation with hundreds of ways to outwit the vigilance of the police. Clearly, if Lenin ever does lose his confidence in the workers and in the fundamental relevance of the Western model, he is going to find his organizational plan much harder to defend. Looking ahead, Lenin evokes the West European worker movements to explain to his worker readers why political freedom must be their most urgent goal. Quote, "No economic struggle can bring firm improvements to the workers. None can even be carried out on a broad scale. If the workers do not have the right to freely set up meetings, set up unions, have their own papers, send their own representatives to popular assemblies, as do the workers of Germany and all other European countries except Turkey and Russia." End quote. The Rабочая Gazeta articles bring out clearly the logic behind Lenin's plan. We must build a party as much like the SPD as possible under absolutist conditions, so we can overthrow the Tsar and obtain the political liberties we need to make the party even more like the SPD. A draft program for our party, 1899. We end our survey with yet another stab at coming up with an actual program for the fledgling Social Democratic Party. A draft program for our party was also written for Rabочая Gazeta and remained unpublished. It is more a discussion piece about the principles of a social democratic program than an actual program draft. Lenin's continued efforts to provide a program is itself a consequence of his Erfurtian outlook. A proper social democratic party has a clear statement of principles that serves as a banner for the army of fighters for socialism. The party banner raises the morale of the combatants and sends a message to outsiders. According to Lenin, a program should grasp the whole movement, while in practice, of course, now one, now another side of the movement must be moved into the foreground. In this sense, what is to be done is a practical book, not a programmatic one, since it deals with specific issues that occupied the forefront at a particular time. Much misunderstanding of what is to be done results from treating it as a programmatic book that attempts to grasp the whole movement. Our long journey through Lenin's genuinely programmatic writings provides us with a context for avoiding these errors. For the actual text of the program, Lenin goes back to a draft program issued by Plekhanov's Emancipation of Labor Group in 1885. He announces that this draft is still basically sound and needs only partial corrections. In the course of our survey, we've seen Lenin assert several times that he is defending the tradition both of international social democracy and Russian social democracy. His adoption of a 14-year-old draft program as a basic text is a striking expression of his loyalty to Russian social democracy as defined by the Plekhanov Group. How does his loyalty fit into the Erfurtian framework? Earlier, we looked at an article by populist Pyotr Lavrov arguing that social democracy was mostly inapplicable to Russian political conditions. In that article, he scoffed that the Russian Social Democrats let the Germans write their program for them. This sort of remark must have rankled, since Lenin responds to it 4 years later. Quote, "Not in the slightest are we afraid to say that we wish to imitate the Erfurt program. There is nothing bad about imitating something good. Precisely because one so often hears opportunist and half-hearted criticism of this program, we consider it our duty to openly speak up for it." End quote. The Erfurt program is thus the essential model. The draft of the Plekhanov group is acceptable because it passes the test presented by the German program. As Lenin says, the theses of the Plekhanov program have again and again received confirmation in the development of socialist theory, as well as the development of the worker movement in all countries. When there is a clash between the Erfurt program and the Plekhanov program, for an example, in the demand found in the Russian program for direct popular legislation to supersede representative parliaments, the Erfurt program takes precedence. Of course, the Erfurt program must be adjusted to meet Russian conditions. Lenin mentions two main issues requiring creative adaptation: the lack of political freedom and the peasant question. We've discussed the first issue at length throughout this chapter. Lenin's treatment of the peasant issue in this article is his first statement of his proposals of a peasant strategy for Russian social democracy. His elaboration and defense of his strategy is a major theme in his writings of the Iskra period. Since what is to be done does not take up the peasant question, another reason why it is not a programmatic work, we will not go into the details of Lenin's strategy. All that is necessary here is to show that Lenin is searching for an answer to an Erfurtian problem. The Erfurtian outlook calls on Russian social democracy to become a tribune of the people, to act as the most resolute defender of their current non-socialist interests, and to mobilize their support in the fight for political freedom. Many people will ask whether this strategy is even possible in the case of the peasants, since, it is said, the Marxists saw the peasants as nothing more than a sack of potatoes, had only contempt for the mental capacities of the peasants, saw them as the main barrier to social progress, and so forth. Although these assumptions about the Marxist outlook have no basis, Lenin does proceed with uncharacteristic defensiveness here because he feels there are valid social democratic suspicions that he must dispel. These suspicions concern peasant interests and peasant revolutionary qualities. Lenin's view of peasant interests can be summarized as follows. Modern economic development is ending the possibility of independent small-scale production. This is inevitable, there's nothing we can do about it, nor should we want to. But the loss of independence can take place in three different contexts. The best context for small producers like the peasants would be a socialist society under proletarian class rule. In this case, the process of losing independence will take place voluntarily and without victimization. When the process takes place under capitalism, the human costs are much higher: expropriation, impoverishment, ruin. But even worse is a third possibility. The peasants face the onslaught of capitalism while bound hand and foot by the autocratic order, by the restrictions imposed by the peasant commune, and by artificial economic dependence on the noble landowners. To try to protect the peasants against capitalism by preserving this kind of restriction, for example, protecting the peasant commune by not permitting the peasant to refuse or to sell his allotment of land, is nonsense. It will not stop capitalism, but it will stop peasants from using their resources as they best see fit. On the contrary, social democracy must push for the removal of all these restrictions and enlist peasant support for the removal of the most repulsive restriction of them all, the Tsarist autocracy. Lenin is somewhat defensive when it comes to devising the specific measure to implement this strategy because he does not want to be seen, either in the eyes of other social democrats or in foro interno, as encouraging small-scale at the expense of large-scale production. So he makes a distinction between ending dependence, progressive, and encouraging small-scale production, reactionary. The hostility to restrictions on individual peasants implies a large overlap with the standard liberal definition of the situation. Lenin is perfectly well aware of this overlap, and even brings it out in another article written around this time. The overlap with liberalism on this point is somewhat similar to the overlap about political freedom. Besides these calculations, there would seem to be a moral dimension to Lenin's program, as we see from this version of the sooner or later argument addressed to fellow social democrats. Quote, "Of course, the development of capitalism is leading and will lead, in the final analysis, to the removal of these holdovers of serfdom, all by itself in the natural way of things. But in the first place, these holdovers possess extraordinary tenacity so that one cannot rely on their swift removal. In the second place, and this is the main point, this natural path means nothing other than the dying out of the peasants who are factually, thanks to labor services and the like, tied to the land and enserfed to the landowner. It goes without saying that under these circumstances, social democrats cannot pass over this question in silence and their program." Social Democrats cannot remain indifferent spectators of the starvation of the peasants and their destruction from death by starvation. Never could there be two opinions among Russian Social Democrats about the necessity of the broadest possible help to the starving peasants. And is there anyone who will affirm that such help is possible without revolutionary measures?" End quote. The other prejudice to which Lenin responds somewhat defensively concerns the peasants' revolutionary qualities. Lenin assures the reader that he is well aware of the peasant lack of development and darkness, and that violent peasant outbursts are not the same as purposive revolutionary struggle. Certainly, the Social Democrats cannot count on the peasant, but times are changing, and the Social Democrats would be derelict if they did not cheer and encourage the growing peasant purposiveness. Here, Lenin cites a classic Marx passage about the emerging conflict within the peasantry between the tendency to support despotic regimes such as Napoleon III and the tendency to fight against them. The actual strategy proposed by Lenin in 1899 is hardly bold. Return some of the peasant land taken at the time of the peasant emancipation in 1861, and adopt a maybe so, maybe no attitude to peasant revolutionary action. But if we look at Lenin's reasoning and the direction in which he's moving, we will easily see the continuity in his peasant strategy throughout his career. My point here is that this innovative strategy arose out of his search for a way to fulfill Erfurtian guidelines. To support this contention, let us leap ahead a few years and look at Kautsky's remarkable 1906 article, "The Driving Forces of the Russian Revolution and Its Prospects." Here, Karl Kautsky, the authoritative spokesman for Erfurtianism, turns to Russia and lays out the basic hegemony strategy that, as I argued earlier, was implied in his 1893 book Parliamentarism. Only the overthrow of the autocracy will unleash economic progress among the Russian peasants. The Russian bourgeoisie has good reason to shy away from revolutionary measures. The proletariat must lead the peasantry on the basis of genuine and durable common interests. The coming revolution will not be a standard bourgeois revolution, but who cares? Particularly striking is Kautsky's account of the transformation of the Russian peasant in recent years from a good-natured, sleepy, unreflective creature of habit into an energetic, restless, and untiring fighter who strives toward something new and better. Oppression that earlier would have crushed him now makes him stand taller. Quote, "He no longer allows others to think for him. He is compelled to think for himself, compelled to use all his mother wit, all his energy, all his recklessness, to cast out all his prejudices so that he firmly can assert himself in the incredible whirlwind of events into which he's been drawn." End quote. Lenin was in ecstasy. He promptly translated Kautsky's article into Russian and provided it with a preface that began, quote, "The advanced Russian workers have long known Karl Kautsky as their writer, one who can not only explain and provide foundations for the theoretical teachings of revolutionary Marxism, but can also apply them on the basis of real knowledge and serious analysis of the facts to the complicated and confused questions of the Russian Revolution." End quote. Lenin saw Kautsky's argument as a complete vindication. A bourgeois revolution carried out by the peasantry and proletariat, despite the unreliability of the bourgeoisie, this fundamental proposition of Bolshevik tactics is completely confirmed by Kautsky. In his 1899 critique of the new voices of social democracy, Lenin presented himself as having more confidence in the workers than his opponents. In arguments with fellow social democrats about the peasants, Lenin, along with Kautsky, presents himself as having more confidence in the peasants as well. Lenin's wager is that the peasants will become more and more independent and purposive. They will understand their interests better, and they will realize that the rational way to achieve their interests is revolutionary struggle under the guidance of the social democratic proletariat. Lenin hedges his bets with the peasants in a way that he does not with the workers. If the workers do not respond, social democracy is dead. If the peasants do not respond, well, it's too bad, but life and struggle go on. Nevertheless, Lenin placed hopes on the peasantry that struck many then, and strike many now, as unrealistically optimistic. We should keep this fact in mind when assessing the debates over what is to be done's alleged worry about workers. We have ended our trek through Lenin's programmatic writings from the beginning of his career in 1894 to the end of his Siberian exile in 1899. We leave him as he goes abroad in preparation for a new phase in his career. The reader may feel our journey has been somewhat monotonous at times. In fact, I hope so, because one of my main points is the unwearying regularity with which Lenin presents his Erfurtian outlook. The continuity is nicely symbolized by the quotations from Kautsky: social democracy is the merger of socialism and the worker movement, and Liebknecht: studieren, propagandieren, organisieren, that we find both in 1894 and 1899. The presentation changes in emphasis according to polemical context. Lenin passes lightly over points when he believes that his audience agrees with him, and concentrates on points when he thinks his audience needs convincing. But the entire Erfurtian checklist can almost always be found. The narrative underpinning the outlook, the inspiring story of the European worker parties as interpreted by the Erfurt program, is usually in evidence. When Lenin feels that core social democratic values are under attack, as in the protest writings of 1899, this narrative surfaces in passionate detail. The 1890s were a time of great change for Russian society and for the worker movement in particular, and Lenin's rhetoric reflects these changes. For the most part, developments only strengthened Lenin's Erfurtian faith. Things seem to be proceeding according to the Erfurtian scenario. In the 1890s, the workers began to stage militant protests, began to accept social democratic guidance, and force the government to make concessions. The Social Democrats themselves were weak and disorganized, so this success could only mean they had correctly identified a vast and powerful social force. In 1898, the merger took a giant step forward with the creation of at least a notional Russian Social Democratic Worker Party. Lenin had nothing to do with this step forward, a circumstance which must have increased his confidence in the universality of the merger narrative that predicted a drive in all countries toward an independent worker party as the highest form of class struggle. True, Lenin was surprised and shocked by the social democratic voices that emerged in 1899. The skepticism within social democratic ranks was something he had not predicted. His first reaction was to reassert his core Erfurtian values. His second or third reaction were not any different. In 1899, Lenin begins to set out some of the policy proposals that he later defended in What Is to Be Done. We shall look at these proposals in more detail in later chapters. Here, we note only that the proposals were presented and defended in Erfurtian terms. So why do we read What Is to Be Done? For most people, no doubt, the interest of the book is not in the specific policies it advocates, but in the general framework of ideas used to justify the proposals, since What Is to Be Done is supposed to tell us about the core values that Lenin later applied to very different situations. But if that is the case, our work is done. Lenin does not develop any new core of values between 1899 and 1901. The examination of What Is to Be Done will tell us nothing about these values that we don't know already. Nevertheless, we shall proceed to give background context for the concrete policies and polemics of What Is to Be Done. This context is necessary for understanding What Is to Be Done as a historical document, that is, as an event in the life of Russian social democracy. It's also necessary to clear away the misconceptions that have prevented readers from seeing What Is to Be Done's Erfurtian heart. And so we now focus our attention on one particular episode in the story of Russian social democracy: Iskra's drive to consummate the merger between socialism and the Russian worker movement.
Как родная меня мать провожала, тут и вся моя родня набежала, тут и вся моя родня набежала. А куда ж ты, паренек, а куда ты? Не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты, не ходил бы ты, Ванек, во солдаты. В Красной армии штыки чай найдутся, без тебя большевики обойдутся, без тебя большевики обойдутся. Поклонился всей родне у порога, не скулите вы по мне, ради Бога, не скулите вы по мне, ради Бога. Будь такие все, как вы, ротозеи, что осталось от Москвы, от России, что осталось от Москвы, от России. Все пошло на старый лад, на неволю, взяли все у нас назад, землю волю, взяли все у нас назад, землю волю.